So first, I want to say thanks for all you've done. Your mug muffin recipe is just absolutely delicious.
Okay. Well, folks, that is John Bassett, and John has got an interesting story to tell us. Not interesting so much in a good way, but the result is going to be fine. John is dealing with LADA diabetes, something I don't talk about a lot. But John, welcome to Beat Diabetes.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to at least share some of my story.
Yeah, I was doing a little research about LADA, and one of the things I read that was kind of chilling was that they mentioned, what percent of type 2 diabetics seem to fit in that LADA the region of LADA, and it was like between 5 and 12%, but they said this will likely only grow exponentially, so that's not so good. But before we go very far, tell us what LADA means, and then you can go ahead and tell us your story and how you came to where you are right now.
Yeah, it stands for latent autoimmune diabetes in adults. From my perspective, what I understand it is it's a transition later in life from normal and or type 2 diabetes into type 1 diabetes, a slow, very frustrating transition because, it seems like the understanding from type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes is a little clearer on what you should do. But I'd say I'm still transitioning. I still have some very weak pancreatic function. But basically the doctor's thinking I'm type 2 diabetic when indeed my pancreas is failing to produce insulin at all, and the treatments were just erratic, and you just couldn't understand why I couldn't get things under control.
Yeah, the thing you normally hear, and I agree with mostly, but not completely, is that the problem with type 1 diabetics is that they produce no insulin. The problem with type 2 diabetes is they end up producing way too much insulin because they're insulin resistant. But they don't really count for folks like you that are producing very, very little. Maybe technically you're not a type 1 yet, but you're moving that direction. I've heard some people refer to the LADA situation, LADA, as a slow motion moving from type 2 to type 1. Is that about how you see it?
Yeah, I would say that's how I saw it, and I'd say like 2 years ago I would have said I'm a type 2 diabetic, but then I fell off a cliff, about 18 months ago, where just nothing I could do to keep the blood sugar in control. I did in November of 2003. I think I found your podcast first before any about what to do about carbohydrates, and I started down a low carb diet, and I've had a few months where I've gone complete carnivore to see if I could get blood sugars in line. But I'd say now I fall more into the ketovore approach, ultra low carb, ketogenic style diet. But even with that, what was happening is, my blood sugars were still, fasting blood sugars still in the 140s. Even with, I could go, a month of carnivore eating, higher fats and animal proteins, and still, the Mother Nature taking over and converting that protein into sugar, and I just had no insulin to deal with it.
Well, that's got to be very frustrating, and some people that would watch me might say, "Okay, well then all I do is go low carb, and it immediately goes down. Everything resolves itself." But in the case of the LADA situation, where your pancreas is putting out so little insulin, you can almost look at a meal and your blood sugar starts to rise. I mean, you become very, very sensitive. Once in a while, somebody will say, well, I've been keto for 6 months and my blood sugar is still all over the map. It's terrible. And I won't diagnose them. I'm not a doctor, but my thought is, well, you may be putting out very little insulin.
Yeah, my traditional endocrinologist, well, my GP, my A1C was in the 6.2 range, and I asked him, I said, hey, this is a couple of years ago. I said, can we at least go on metformin? And he begrudgingly put me on it. 3 months later, I had another A1C. It was 6.4. It went up. And so I asked if, he could send me to an endocrinologist. And we did that, put me on glimepiride. Okay, got my A1Cs down a little bit, but the minute I don't take those and everybody's telling me that's a dangerous drug, it's forcing your pancreas to release insulin, you're going to burn out. So I look for other alternatives. Tried Jardians, which put me into an energy fatigue mode I could not tolerate. It I liked the stability of the blood sugar that it gave me, but it wasn't ideal. At one point in time, I just went, even during the low carb thing, I walking 5 miles a day, resistance training a couple times a week, and the next thing you know, my blood sugar is 7. Okay, a lot of people watching this aren't going to be too worried about 7, but I'm one of those analytical types that knows there's something wrong. I'm heading in the wrong direction. And I went to the endocrinologist, and, with the diet and the medications, she's like, well, now you're in the 5.9, 5.8 range. Now you're in the top 97%. You're okay. But my blood sugars were telling me a different story. Fasting blood sugar, high A1C, not quite in the normal range, but typical of somebody with insulin resistance. Just felt like something was wrong. And I did switch to one of the online doctors who's very good. Am I allowed to say his name? I'm not sure if that's
Go ahead. I mean, it won't bother me.
Okay, Dr. Robert Silas.
Yeah, I've seen some of his videos. He seems very solid.
Okay, and he agreed that we need to do more. We need to get it lower, and he did a whole series of additional tests beyond what my endocrinologist did, like fasting insulin levels, et cetera. And at that time, they were what one would consider in the normal range. My C-peptide was in a good range, but I was still having horrible blood sugar spikes. So he did a couple of other tests, and keep in mind, I'm eating low carb all the time. I occasionally, when I'd eat a meal, unbeknown to me, having hidden carbs out at a restaurant, skyrocket. And it's like, okay, it just doesn't feel right. So he tried a few things, and basically at the end of the summer last year, 2024, said, look, your insulin's not horrible. But I don't think you're producing enough insulin. And he did put me on, Tresiba, but starting off at these very low doses, as well as Novolog for when I have spikes, and we have a methodology for doing that. But I still was struggling with the same problems, even taking insulin. I'm like, Dr. Silas, I'm still not getting this into what is normal range. And obviously I'm not doing as much damage. And he kept saying that. He's like, John, you're not doing the damage that you were doing with the lower carb diet, but the numbers still aren't right. So we started increasing the doses of Tresiba to a level that, he decided that he was going to start doing some of the autoimmune tests. And at that point, he did determine that I'm borderline Hashimoto's. My ANA is high. Two of the other tests were negative that are typical for LADA, and that's the GAD65 and the pancreatic islet test. He says, but you still have autoimmune disease. And he ran another round of blood work, and sure enough, my insulin levels are way low, and the C-peptide is showing my pancreas is just pooped out.
And this happened over the course of about a year or so, would you say?
Yeah, about 18 months. Yeah, I mean, I had indications of what I would say was insulin resistance type 2 diabetes, going back, maybe 25 years, but I just exercised through it. I just did a lot of exercise. I did watch my carbs for a few years, but it seemed to be going great because I was exercising. It was, exercising through it. But then, as Mother Nature and age started setting in, I can't work out quite as hard as I used to. I've had a few surgeries, and of course, you're laid up for multiple weeks, and your body's very unforgiving about that during the recovery stage. And so, a couple of years ago, it started looking like, that was, I was starting to be more susceptible to the diabetes again. So I tried to pick up the exercise again because I had healed. Ultra low carb diet, and things just kept getting worse. I just kept being very frustrated that I was doing everything in my power to control this with diet, watching what I eat, continuing to take diabetic medication through that. Never was able to really get off of it, other than I tried getting off of the medication, and of course, it just made matters worse.
When a person is diagnosed as diabetic, usually there's a tremendous emotional response because that's the last thing anybody wants to hear. But in your case, it's not just diabetes. You're facing the fact that you may, for practical purposes, be, if not a type 1 diabetic, about the same. In other words, your pancreas may end up where it produces almost nothing. In fact, you're almost there right now. How have you handled that emotionally at this point?
Actually, it's a relief. At this point, it's a relief. Okay, I know now, right? I'm not going to be able to follow people like, well, even your podcast and Dr. Barry's podcast, reversing the type 2 diabetes. Sure, I have insulin resistance, and that part of my life has improved. But the low carb diet is not all I have to do. I have to supplement with insulin.
Yeah, you're gonna, I'm not a doctor, but if your pancreas isn't working, I mean, it's pretty much a given. You're going to be taking insulin the rest of your life. Of course, there's a big difference between the person who says, all right, my pancreas doesn't work, so I can just stuff myself with carbs, versus a person who says, all right, my pancreas doesn't work, so I better be real careful and be very precise in how much insulin I give myself. I think I know which way you come down on that question, but go ahead and tell us about it.
Yeah, that's for sure. Knowing, first off, my daughter's type 1 diabetic. She has been since she was 17 years old. And I've seen her battles, and she has not necessarily controlled her diet all the time. And I've seen, even while on insulin, a girl who's had blood sugars in the 6, 7, 800 range. And it's like, oh, it can just take more insulin. Well, that causes all kinds of body issues as well. Insulin, first off, it seems to be, it doesn't seem to be the friendliest medication for weight. If you take if you eat what you want and just take insulin, you're going to put on a lot of weight, right? It's just the way it is, which is unhealthy. It's not good metabolically. So I did read Dr. Bernstein's book on, his type 1 diabetes journey, and he's 90 something years old now. And you know darn well, if you follow a strict protocol, you don't have to die from this.
Yeah, he's living proof of that for sure, and there are many others. That's got to be encouraging. One thing you had going for you when you were getting involved, you were not totally ignorant. You were not the guy that's just eating a lot of junk and totally taken by surprise. You were keeping a pretty close eye on glucose levels, A1C, listening to different podcasts, and so reading books. So that kind of helped you, didn't it?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I read your book. Actually, didn't read it. I listened to it on Audible. The 60 what's this 60 thoughts on dealing with diabetes, and it was really enlightening as well. I think that's where I got the pumpkin pie recipe, which made my Thanksgiving quite enjoyable, and the muffins where let's face it, carnivore diet's tough, right? It's not the most easy to sustain diet, and there are some things that I like. Low carb, the muffins are one of them. The pumpkin pie, okay, it could be better. Keto ice cream, delicious, right? I can still have some things that are enjoyable and still not cause any metabolic issues to myself. And part of that was my motivation as well. At my age, I did get a CAC score, and it's 154. So my diabetes has caused, some cardiovascular issues that I now have to keep a close eye on. Not horrendous, but certainly not zero. And that means I've got to pay close attention to what's going on.
John and I went on to talk another 15 minutes or so, and I decided to break our interview into 2 segments. I'll share the second segment probably next time around. But for this segment, I wanted to kind of conclude by highlighting those words that you may find kind of surprising. And it has to do with when I asked him, well, how did you feel when you found out that this was LADA, which is essentially kind of a slow motion moving from type 2 to type 1 diabetes, type 1 being the one kind of diabetes nobody wants at all. Nobody wants either one, type 2 or 1, but especially type 1, where you have to take insulin always. And but I want to highlight what he said. He said it was a relief. It was a relief. And what he indicated was at least he knew what was going on, and then he could take steps to deal with that. And, there is a question that is asked universally, every culture, every language. Everybody asks this question usually many times in their life. In fact, they made a song just about this question. And the question is, what's going on? You remember that? I think it was done in the 60s, so some of you may be too young for that. But what's going on? That's what I was asking when my blood sugar was bouncing all over the place and diabetes was coming at me. What is going on? Why do I sometimes feel faint? And you don't know. There's nothing you can do by looking at your body and say, oh, okay, well, I see what's going on. Now, you can go to a doctor. You should go to a doctor if you've got issues. But even then, sometimes they can't exactly tell you what's going on. Sometimes they'll give you an A1C and say, well, it seems like it's in range, a little bit on the high side, but I guess it's not too bad. Just better watch your sugar. And yet you may be in much more metabolic trouble than they or you realize. What's going on? And John was watching things carefully, doing tests, going to the doctor, having tests done on him, finding out his A1C and all of these things. And now he knows what's going on, and he's like, well, that's kind of a relief. Now I know what I can do. And it was the same for me when the secretary where I worked came one day to work with a glucometer, and she gave it to me as a present. Her husband was diabetic, and she got one for me, taught me how to use it. That was the beginning of the answer for me to the question, what's going on? And then when you do more research, you realize there are ways to deal with this issue. Even if you're type 1, Dr. Bernstein has shown us all clearly you can even deal with it and live to an old age and be healthy. And ultimately, that's what we all want. We want to live to an old age and be healthy throughout most of those old age years. Type 2, same thing. LADA, same thing. So regardless of what's going on, there are ways to deal with it, but it starts with knowing what is going on and in your body. So yes, go to the doctor, have tests done, have an A1C done. And one of the things that helped me so much was something that is known as a postprandial test. I usually just call it a post-meal test. You eat a meal, you wait about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. And you test before the meal, you test about an hour and 15 minutes after the meal, and you see how big is the spread, how far did I go? If you started out at 105 before the meal and now you're at 220 after the meal, you've got big issues. On the other hand, if you start out at 105 and after the meal, an hour and 15 minutes later, you're at 122, well, that ain't bad at all. And it's going to vary tremendously with what you put in your mouth. So all of these things you begin to learn, you begin to do research. The good news is there are pioneers who've gone before you. My friend, I don't care what's going on with you, whether you're type 1, type 2, pre-diabetic, you've got LADA, whatever it is. There are people who've gone before you who have figured this thing out. And for the type 1, Dr. Bernstein is a perfect example. So when you begin to understand there are people who have found answers to these things. And you know, there's some people would say, well, Dr. Bernstein didn't beat type 1. I mean, he still has to take insulin. Yeah, but look what he's done with his life. I see myself in a similar way, although in a much smaller way. I'm no Dr. Bernstein for sure, but in my little dentist way, I asked the question, what's going on? And when the secretary brought in that glucometer and I began to test and get other tests done, I began to realize what's going on with me. And now I've been in control of things by the grace of God for about 23 years. And what's going on is health. What's going on is normalized blood sugar levels and feeling good. And here I am, an old man, and I'm still going on. I'm going on. So there are pioneers who have led the way. Read their books, watch their YouTube videos, learn whatever you can, listen to testimonies of people who have beat diabetes. And you will find some victory.